Hi, my name is Benedict. In this video we are looking at a new synthesizer from me. It's called Bandy. It has limited applications, but at the same time it'll do a lot more than you think. We'll start by running through some example sounds. They're not presets, because as you know from me, presets just don't happen. Here's what Bandy was primarily designed for. As you hear, we've got a BandPass kind of sound. It ends up, in this situation, sounding like an early to mid-90s digital synthesizer. Digital wasn't the plan, it was just a case of like, here's an interesting idea. What if I take several oscillators, put each through a bandpass filter, so we just pick out the bit of that oscillator sound that we want to hear, and then combine them as a single oscillator. And in this case, very representative of the sorts of things that you can end up with. There's a tiny bit of echo happening over here, but we hear there's a chorus. Obviously these sorts of sounds, like any digital type synth, will benefit a lot from chorusing and effects. And in this case, to show you, to get the phaser kind of sound, we're using a band reject filter to be swept, in this case over Reason's CV system. Just about any DAW will do that sort of stuff. So anything in this arena, and they won't all sound like this sound. This is merely representative of the kinds of things that I was chasing from the beginning. Something that you will notice is that it's not strong at all on the fundamental. We'll get into how that works later, but one of the reasons that analog sounds so is because there's an awful lot of fundamental, especially after we've been doing the subtractive filtering, whereas this you can remove the fundamental so much that the sound barely sits anywhere, which is a good and bad thing. Turns out to be very good for electric piano type things. Turn off the drive. And that's using a feature of having the oscillators slightly detuned from each other. It just gives you a slightly different result if you've got your filter and your bands set apart from each other. Here they're pretty close, but you can use them set quite apart and you end up with a different sort of a sound. So surprisingly good for electric piano type stuff. Not to everybody's taste, but we can use it for striking leads. Here the phaser is not really meant to be heard so much as just removing the staticness, as we do with almost every time we use a phaser. So you see here, there's a certain amount of offset for our bands, which are making up the single oscillator that we perceive that we are hearing. So a greater range than you might think. Not, as I said, to everybody's taste, that kind of sound, but it is definitely going to stand out in a mix because it's like, oh, that doesn't sound like the usual suspects. And honestly, I was not expecting this. I was working on a string machine type sound, which was pretty cool, and then again, not to everybody's taste, but wow, how cool is that if you like synth brass. In this case, a lot of the comes from the movement that comes with sixth dimension. which is adding a lot of richness as well as that multi-voice stereo routine. So as we see, it's capable of a lot more in terms of sounds than you initially think. They're just going to feel different. Again, being one of my synths, there are no presets. My synths are very much about finding your own way, finding your own path. Now, if you want this, I'm thinking probably only a couple of dollars on my Ko-fi or Ko-fi account. There will be a link down below. You go there, you pay, you download it, you take the whole Bandy folder out of the zip, obviously. You take it out and you put it in program files, common VST3. You put the whole folder in there. If you take bits out of the folder, it won't work. If it's not working, it means you took bits out of the folder. It is a universal VST3. Now, that in theory means that it will run on a Mac, but I don't have a Mac, nor do I know anyone I trust well enough to actually get feedback on it running. So I will officially say it runs on Windows. You see it on Windows 11 in Reason. Reason's pretty fussy, and here it's running just dandy. If you have any support issues or anything like that, you must post those here on YouTube on the video. Please don't send me private messages thinking that A, it's going to get you special attention or avoid looking less than proful to everybody else. It's just silly. Put the question there in public. If you look at my other devices, you'll find there's effectively no questions because they just work. Righto, the device itself. This is the manual part of the program. What we have is this when it opens up. We've got a little bit of reverb happening just to stop it from being so. We've got our general volume goes up and down. It is prone to running quite loud at times, and then it can run really quiet. A lot of the reason for difference in level is the Q width, the resonance, but how pointy your bandpass filters are. So your standard ADSR, you can choose how many note poly you want, and you can choose how big a pitch bend range you want. At the moment set to 12. So I can pretend to be Kraftwerk or Gary Newman. You can change that to anywhere from 0 to 12 semitones. Standard enough stuff. Now, the way that it works is we have got 1, 2, 3, I'll call them sub-oscillators. Effectively, it's a one oscillator synth, but there are 3 sub-oscillators that build that single oscillator. So if you want to think of it as a 3 oscillator synth, go for it. But it's a 1 oscillator synth built from 3 sub-oscillators. Each of these are the same, hence having the same letters. The letters kind of represent the first letter of what it's for. Trying to type the whole thing out was just going to get killer, and attempting to write it in one place was just going to be, I don't know, so 1982 Korg, it wasn't funny. We've then got another section which is essentially the same, but it's just handling noise. First we have our fundamental waveform. All 3 of our sub-oscillators use the same waveform. So it can be sine, saw, ramp, which is a backwards saw. It can be a triangle wave, which sounds kind of like a square but isn't. A square, which is fully square. Dude. White noise, or pink noise. Difference simply being that the pink noise is more low-end focused, white noise is more even across, but will tend to have less low-end. Easy to think you're not going to use those. I actually forgot, but you can actually do some very cool big drum type sounds. No, not 808s, but big drum type sounds. So if you assign, let's say, this one to pink noise, and then you've got your white noise here, you can do cool stuff with that. I might go into that later, I might not, but that is what you can do. If you're using sine, purely sine, then we've got octave, there's no semitone. got what octave. So if we set 3, we've got a very basic additive synth. So the beginnings of a Hammond type organ. You can detune by quite a fair way. As I said, when your filters are fairly close to each other, it's going to seem more like a normal 3 oscillator synth, and your detuning, you're not going to get away with an awful lot. But if you've got a massive difference in where one of the bands sit and another band sit, then you can actually do quite a lot of detuning, and then it changes to a less musical tone, becomes more untuned or clangorous. So you can get scraping sounds and that sort of thing from it. This is not necessarily going to come super easy. So it's possibly not the first synth that the average person would get. But once you grok, like really understand how it works, how it thinks, it'll get a lot easier. So yes, you can use this as wrong knob. To create basic organ sounds. Obviously only got 3 of your partials, but it is definitely a doable thing. Next we can look at a sawtooth wave. Broadly probably the one you can use the most. We can set, you'll find that the tuning isn't as you're used to. If we take our filter, let's just turn, so we've only got the 1. We can choose which part of this we want to hear. We can say, okay, I want to keep the fundamental. Bearing in mind we'll come to key scaling in a moment. And how pointy, and to some extent how loud, that BandPass comes. So how much of this are we letting through? Until, of course, it just plain howls. No doubt someone's going to find a use for that. Some sort of Jimi Hendrix kind of moment. While it sort of seems like it's a volume, remember it's making this more narrow. And that is how we decide we're creating our final oscillator, by saying I want a slice of this, a slice of that, and a slice of that. So we can say, I'll go with that for the bottom of my sound. I will go with that for the middle of my sound. And that for the top of my sound. I might even say, oh, I'm going to soften that up, or still keep it really hard, but lower the level. So as you hear, we've now got a unique sounding oscillator. It's not going to sound like a mini Moog because it's not meant to sound like a mini Moog. That's your mindset. So let's turn these guys back off again. So we've covered our basic tuning. Actually, just to give you a sense, we can say, okay, I want this one to use so even though they are different octaves, they become our core oscillator. We can create a little bit of offset. As you see, we can go a fair way with that one. And obviously, if we were to bring in we've now got a pretty cool sound. Let's turn him out. And these guys down again. So filter, Q, which is our width, and then we've got key follow. For the moment, I've had all the key follows set to off. So you simply saying across the whole keyboard, I'm just going to listen to this bit, and this bit of the frequency. You can then change this to full key follow. You can go anywhere in between. I haven't experimented much with the in between, but it can be interesting. So in this case, I want to find the fundamental, which is almost always going to be at the bottom. So if I say, okay, that's my fundamental, then my next bit I want, okay, I'll have that for the mid. And then what do I want for the high? And we've created a waveform. So here it gets kind of clangorous, or a lot more stable. We can then obviously do the usual things of feeding it to a filter. Band's name to Japan. Unusual tones is the whole idea. Again, if we turn them off into pad, gives us that really lovely kind of mid-90s workstation feel. I've sometimes struggled to get those in normal synths, which is part of what drove me to end up finishing this. It's lovely tones that you can get which are different, they're just not going to sound like yet another Serum synth, if you know what I mean. Nothing against Serum. With filters, seeing we're talking filters, then we can take our filter and make it 24 dB. It's 12 dB by default because it's the most versatile and flexible, but if you want it to be a bit more aggressive, we can go with high pass. Which is not going to have quite the same bite, especially if we've lopped some of our fundamental off by simply not prioritizing it in the mix. And we can go through another band pass. Bit shrill. So a unique kind of a tone. It's not that other synths couldn't do it, but they generally will tend not to. And as you saw before, the band reject just slices a hole. Obviously, as you turn the reso up, then it becomes a lot less, well, cool. So each one of these has its potential uses. So that's really lovely that the filter interacts really quite nicely. If you want it not in the game, then just set it to 12 and leave it off, and you're not going to notice any difference one way or another. So that's the core of our oscillators, and that by taking our 3 sub-oscillators and creating one oscillator, what feels like one oscillator out of that, then we can create these interesting tones. Now, we'll go back into a pad type mode. We've still got our thing on. You can set modulation here. So if we're listening only to the first one here, what this is modulating is the filter cutoff. So this filter is being told to waggle up and down. So we might do something like this. And by setting them to different rates and depths, here we've now got a really complex evolving tone, timbre. Whilst we're on modulation, then we've got a vibrato, which will go from really slow for drunken stuff. I know people are going to want to use it for that. Or faster for strings and what have you. And then last, we've got noise. The same filter and resonance, and then simply introduce white noise. You've got no choice as which flavour it is, it's white. You can choose its colour through use of your filter. Obviously no need for key following in this case because it's noise. If you want it to feel like that noise is a bit more integrated, change your tuning, back it off a little bit. And of course I forgot to show you, these can all be set to key follow. So you saw there the instance where one of them was key followed and the other two weren't. When you introduce the key follow, you will need to reset your filter positions, just the way it works. Of course, if we then add some echo, let's go with one I prepared earlier. Turn off the dry signal. Turn a couple of those guys. Pan them. And not as much for those ones. So really unique and interesting sounds. There is no sort of just do this. It really is an exploratory synth of, as I say, finding the bits that you want to pull out. So if you think of a whole spectrum, if you think of looking at a spectrum window, looking at just the high frequency stuff. Or I could undo that. So these first two sub-oscillators are following key on the keyboard, and the last one is staying static. You'll get very different results one way or another. There's nothing to stop you, as I said, from putting things in the middle. So you'll get different feel across. Now it feels like we're getting some white noise in here, even though we're not. We can add some in. Running through our oscillator shapes again, sine, we'll turn off the white noise. Nice tones. Same, this is a triangle. Square waves. And then of course our noise, which is all very explosive or seashore kind of stuff. You will generally find your saw is the best of them. I considered, do I give each sub its different tone, but it just didn't really seem like a big win there. So as you see, we're simply using our 3 filter points to say I'll have some of this, and some of this. Now there's a huge crossover there, so they tend to hang together, especially when you put some effects on them. Primarily, as I said, designed for pads, but there is nothing to stop you from using them for interesting basses. They're probably not going to give you the classic EDM punch, but I could definitely see myself using them in a more classic style EBM, so industrial dance kind of a situation, because they're different and unusual. Again, experiment. That's the way you're going to find your way through. Obviously, electric piano is the same sort of thing. You're just looking for shorter shapes. It won't give you every style of electric piano, but you will get clavinet, as we saw, kind of a Mark II type sound, and you'll just get interesting results. So Bandy's a thing to reach for when you really just know that you want something different that's going to have that sort of unusual vibe to it, like this. Because it's not driven by the fundamental in the same way as your classic subtractive synth is. I should imagine it would be lovely for taking tones like that, sampling them off, putting them into samples as layers. That's it. If you're interested by it, if you don't quite trust me and that things will run yet, then I have some freebies you can download and try and get my style. Otherwise, it's only a couple of bucks. You've really got nothing to lose, but a fair amount to gain if now and then it ends up giving you really cool, unique sounds inside your mix. All right, all that matters is you get out, you have a good day.